Uh, we're going to talk about a couple of climate action plans, and I think kind of the motivation here is we have an election coming up in which we hope climate is for the first time really going to be a prominent issue in the campaigns. That's what we hope anyway. And I think if you remember, it wasn't until I think the last primary debates when finally even climate action questions were asked of the candidates. So now we have two plans that are have been getting a lot of attention. And what we thought we'd do is introduce these plans to you so you knew what they were all about, talk about a little bit about them, what their features are, what the possible problems are, and so you have some context for what we hope we're going to hear in the upcoming campaigns. So I'm going to hit slide share here now. And what we want is this.
Screen share. That's it.
Okay. And I'm going to put it on slide view. Okay. Hopefully you can all see these slides now.
That looks good.
As I say, there's two plans, and the first plan is one that comes out of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. You probably or might not have even realized that there was such a thing, but this Select Committee has been in existence now for a few years, and they have recently published their Climate Crisis Action Plan. This is the House Committee, House of Representatives Committee. The other plan we're going to talk about is Joe Biden's plan. And as you can see there, I hope he bills it as a plan to build a modern, sustainable infrastructure and equitable, clean energy future. And I'm going to have to move these pictures over a little bit so I can, okay. Both plans are aiming for net zero carbon dioxide emissions economy-wide by no later than 2050. And that's kind of the goal set by, for instance, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in order to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. And both of these plans are shooting for that. The House Select Committee is quite a document. This fellow, Dave Roberts, is a commentator, a journalist who reports on climate and energy issues. And he says there it's the most detailed, well thought out plan for addressing climate change ever been part of US politics. And it's over 500 pages long, very detailed, and it's got literally hundreds of recommendations for congressional action. So we're not going to go through it in detail, obviously, but hopefully we'll give you some kind of an idea what they're talking about. Both of these plans are very comprehensive. And by that, I mean, they rely on a broad range of policies and goals. They're not advocating some single fix or some magic bullet that is gonna, they think will solve our climate issue. They really take a very broad view of things. The plans are ambitious. They envision economy-wide transformation, and they put it in the context really of building an economy around new jobs, clean energy jobs, infrastructure jobs, and so forth. So they're thinking big. They also address prominently environmental justice issues. They have recommendations to ensure that historically underserved communities are considered and displaced workers and so forth. So they're big, ambitious plans. As such, they embrace all the alternative energy sources that have been discussed. Of course, wind, solar, geothermal, and nuclear here are well-established technologies. And although there's continuous new developments with them, we know how they work and we know what they can do. And the question is scaling up. How much can these be scaled? Marine refers here to tidal energy or wave energy. And there's been a fair amount of development there, but it's probably not something that's ready to be deployed at large scale immediately, but these plans actually consider it. Biofuels, they also consider not just things like ethanol and so forth, but algae-based biofuels. And again, there's something that is not really fully developed, but there's a lot of research going on. In any event, the plans envision utilizing whatever they can of all of these. They also address battery technology, which is developing very, very fast, grid modernization. You know, right now our grid is really a patchwork of 3 major interconnection regions, several independent operators and regional operators. And what could be done with a modern, digitally controlled grid is really quite amazing. It's a question of getting down and doing it. And that includes new transmission lines and so forth. Again, these are addressed in both plans. Transportation sector, not just electric vehicles and so forth, but transportation in all its form, in towns and cities and railroads and so forth. My point here is that these plans have something to say about all of these. Also, retrofitting buildings. Buildings are a big source of emissions when it comes down to heating and so forth. Making them more insulated. Manufacturing and agriculture are also dealt with. They have their own special problems because manufacturing, so diversified, uses so many different kinds of energy for so many different purposes. And they also talk about agricultural practices and how improved practices can contribute to the solution of the problem. Okay, the kind of key themes that go through these plans, and I think any really rational plan has to be electrification of the end uses. That is, renewables are good at producing electricity rather than, say, combusting petroleum and so forth. So the more you can electrify, the more useful and easy to accommodate renewables will be. So electrification of end uses and using the renewables to produce electricity is at the heart of any of these plans. And they also talk about the efficiency that's needed for the distribution and to manage the demand. If we electrify everything, the demand for electricity is going to go up. And in order to accommodate a higher demand, we're going to have to think about new ways to distribute and to manage that, and in particular to adjust markets so that they are much more efficient in the way the electricity gets distributed. Okay, just a little overview here. This is where our emissions, our carbon dioxide emissions come from. You can see this is generation of electricity, transportation. The electricity is generated now mainly by coal and natural gas. Transportation is a petroleum source. Industry is varied sources, but largely fossil fuels, and commercial and residential heating and so forth. Agriculture is another of the main sectors. If we just look at the electricity sector alone, here's kind of where we're at. Most of it is generated right now from natural gas, which has been pushing coal out over the last several years because basically because of the economics of natural gas. Nuclear provides about 20%, a little less than 20% of our electricity. And as you can see down here, wind and solar are still very, very small. So we've got a long way to go to push these sources over all the way to the rest of this bar. And of course, this doesn't even include the oil and petroleum that the transportation sector uses. So it's a daunting task, is the point, to switch to renewables that are emission-free in a few decades, which is what the goal is. So here's some of the specific actions that are recommended in these plans, these very ambitious plans. This is taken from the Biden plan, actually, but there's a lot of overlap. They're talking about making 500,000 charging stations for electric vehicles across the country. Because it's probably the biggest obstacle now, besides possibly cost, that is individual costs of buying cars, but that's coming down. So, you know, it's the, what do they call it? The range tension. The people are worried about not being able to recharge. So they're talking about 500,000 charging stations. To put that in perspective, right now in the country, there's less than 200,000 gas stations. So they're really talking about electrifying the automobile system. They talk about quality public transportation for cities over 100,000 population. This is really a big undertaking, but that's what they envision. Electrifying the rail system. Right now, we have electrified railroad in the Northeast Corridor and a few other branches. It could be done everywhere, really. They also talk about, say, converting all school buses to electric. That would be 500,000 school buses. So these are the kinds of specific programs that the Biden plan envisions. And all of these things are doable from a technical point of view. We could, you know, we could build charging stations. We can electrify transportation. The tools that the Biden plan envisions using, and these are also considered by the House committee plan, setting emission standards, which we've done, fuel economy standards, but in kind of a haphazard way that comes and goes with Congress or the administration. Tax credits and subsidies to invest and upgrade. We've tried those in various ways. The use of federal procurement. That is, you know, the government spends a lot on automobiles, power, so forth. If they require clean energy for that, it goes a long way to driving the market. They also talk about establishing an ARPA-C, ARPA Climate. ARPA is Advanced Research Project Agency. We have one for energy. I think there's a couple of them, if I'm not mistaken. But this would be to target new technologies that could really make a difference. So those are the kind of things that are envisioned to move these along. There's policy actions that they recommend. First of all, of course, is recommitting to the Paris Agreement that the present administration has pulled out of. They don't envision mandating we phase out fossil fuels directly, but what they do talk about is discontinuing oil and gas permitting on public lands, end of the subsidies for fossil fuels, which would be a big deal. That amounts to billions of dollars a year in paid basically to fossil fuel companies for exploration and research and so forth. They'd modify the royalties that the fossil fuel companies pay to account for climate change, which basically means increasing the royalties that they would pay. Public companies, publicly traded companies, to disclose the climate impacts or climate risks of their business. That would be in the hope of driving investment towards clean energy. And of course, they could establish a federal fleet of clean vehicles. All the automobiles, trucks, so forth, that government buys would be mandated to be driven by electricity or other form of clean energy. And finally, they talk about integrating climate change into our foreign policy and our national security and trade strategies. Because whatever we do, we're going to have to drive the international community, hopefully, to go along also, because after all, we are not the sole emitter of carbon dioxide. We account now for probably a little less than a quarter of the carbon dioxide put into the air. But there's only a few countries that do account for most of it. And if we did what is envisioned in these plans, it would put a lot of pressure on that work could be used to leverage what the other countries in the world would be doing. That is the idea. Now, there's differences between the two plans that we're talking about, the House plan and the Biden plan. Basically, a lot of the differences can be laid down to the fact that the Biden plan is essentially a campaign statement. It does not go into anywhere near the detail at the House plan. It's a statement of a whole bunch of goals, really. But this is a good thing. It's actually pretty substantial in that if you download it from the web, it takes about 25 pages. So it's not a superficial document by any means. I think the significance of the Biden plan in some ways is that it shows that the Democrats now see climate action as a winning campaign issue. Biden has adopted a much more progressive stance on climate change than he started out with. And I think that in part has been driven by the fact that climate activism amongst young people and new members of Congress and so forth has really had an effect, I suspect. There's other differences. To me, the most significant one is that the House plan includes a price on carbon. That's a carbon tax or fee and dividend, whatever it's been proposed in various forms and shapes over the last few years. And that's always been I think, a policy that has been espoused by environmental groups and various political action groups over the years, because it is a market-driven, it hopes to be a market-driven force for acting on climate. And it's even gained the support of some conservative groups. The Biden plan does not include a price on carbon. And I suspect the reason is because they just wanted to avoid using the word tax in their campaign. Both plans invoke future technological development. And this is kind of important because this is where some of the big questions about these plans come in. They both espouse the continuing use of nuclear energy. The House plan deals a lot with how licensing is done for our current plants, but it talks a little bit about advanced nuclear, not as much as I would have liked to have seen. As a matter of fact, it's pretty short shrift on the proposals for developing really advanced nuclear facilities. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. They also both espouse the idea of carbon capture and sequestration, that is, methods of taking carbon dioxide out of the air. And Larry is going to talk about the issues that brings up. So let me talk about advanced nuclear. I'll also make the point here that the IPCC in their defining pathways where we could limit the change in the absolute temperature, absolute average temperature of the Earth to 1.5 degrees, which is what the Paris Accord is advocating. The IPCC states pretty unequivocally that in almost all cases, you're going to need more nuclear energy. You can't phase out nuclear. And in fact, you've got to build on it. And they also say that we're probably going to have to remove carbon dioxide actively from the air. So what is advanced nuclear? There's many, many designs out there. They've been developed over years. As a matter of fact, some of them go back decades. And they differ in their, well, I've divided it into two general categories here. It's what's called Generation 4 nuclear reactors. And they basically vary in the way they are cooled, the exact form of the fuel that they use, even in some cases, the particular nuclear reactions that produce the energy and so forth. But they have certain things in common, which I'll mention in a minute. There's also these small modular units, small modular reactors that are being developed. And the idea there is that they would use traditional technology pretty much, but on a small scale, and that would have certain very distinct advantages. The Generation 4 reactors, most of them have closed fuel cycles, which means they can generate out of their nuclear waste new fuel. And so the waste becomes fuel, and that has a lot of advantages, of course. It vastly reduces the amount of waste that you have to deal with. It reduces the chance for skullduggery and proliferation. And in some cases, you can actually use as fuel the waste that is now sitting around the country in various repositories, and there's other advantages. They also all rely on passive cooling, which means that if something goes wrong, the thing starts to overheat, you don't have to turn on generators as they had to do in Fukushima and other reactors. They don't have to pump water. They are passively cooled. They will automatically cool down and shut the nuclear reactions off. And that's something that all of these new reactors will incorporate. So they would be a lot safer. As far as the small modular reactors, advantages are they'd have a standardized design so that you could sort of build them mass production, and the licensing would be very simple. You just have to license one design and then you could build a whole bunch of them. And of course, you in rural areas or next to a big factory or something like that. So there's a lot of advantages to the small reactors. Big question is, when will they be ready? And Generation 4 reactors, they were shooting for 2030. This could slip. That's what they're still talking about. As I say, these have been under development for a number of years. I would be very happy if they could get them online in a decade. The small modular reactors, they hope to have a demonstration. The company that's has way out ahead, and most of them hope to have a demonstration by 2024. But I just read this morning news, they kind of lost a big contract. And so that might set them back a while. And I don't know how that's going to pan out. So this is a big issue. One of the real problems is that there's so many competing designs, people don't know where to invest, and it takes a lot of money to develop these. So advanced nuclear has a lot of promise. We don't really know how it's going to pan out. So I'll turn over to Larry now to talk about the removal of carbon dioxide from the air and what the issues are there.
Good. Hear me now?
We hear you.
Okay. Hi.
You might have to get a little closer to your microphone.
A little closer to my microphone, okay? I don't want my nose to get too big in the picture. So Pat did a good job of outlining the two plans. As far as I can tell, they both have the goal of limiting the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. It's an extraordinarily ambitious goal, as you'll see. I understand that the agreement at the Paris Accord was not to exceed 2 degrees, but go very strongly to shoot for 1.5 degrees as the temperature rise. To do that, of course, the world is going to have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions until we reach the point that there's no more CO2 or other GHGs. Can I say GHGs for greenhouse gas? Okay, going into the atmosphere. And I guess the question is, how do climate scientists arrive at what is required to do that? I don't mean what, how do you change the power plants and stuff like that? That's not what they do. But what path do we need to follow in ramping down to get to ramping down the CO2 emissions and the other things to get to the temperature goal? Now, climate scientists, and there's a lot of scientists involved in this, and several groups that do these studies, they conduct what they call scenarios that are based on the assumptions about how the world will respond to the climate crisis. So when do we reach peak emissions, okay? How quickly can we ramp down those peak emissions? How quickly can industrial processes be converted to be greenhouse gas emission free? And the same thing for agriculture and so on. And the climate scientists, they take this set of assumptions, which are basically political and economic, and they put them into their models, which are, maybe you've heard about these, but they're very complex and sophisticated computer codes, okay, which incorporate the chemistry and physics and dynamics of the atmosphere, and they run these things as a function of time to see how the atmosphere responds as time goes on the basis of these assumptions. So here's a chart. If I can, let me go to this thing here, share the screen. Okay. Desktop 1. No.
What are we looking for, Larry?
I'm looking for my desktop.
There we go.
That doesn't look like my desktop. Stop screen sharing. Let me try it again. Just a minute. Let me get, oh, I see what I've got a problem. I've got that. Let me go here, pull this up. Okay. Oh, share.
Yes.
Sorry,
There we go.
I haven't learned to drive this thing yet. Okay. Okay, so what are we looking at here? We're looking at scenarios that you would follow, the world would need to follow to keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees centigrade. So the rate of CO2 reductions, basically. Okay, so what are we're on the horizontal axis here, we're looking at time in 20-year increments. And this is the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere. And the units are billions of tons of carbon dioxide per year. So at the current year, we're putting about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. And here, this black line is what's happened, you know, over the last 40 years. And you can see, of course, that I'm sure you know this, that a precipitate rise in carbon dioxide emission from 1980 to 2020, about almost a factor of 2, okay? And this is where we are now. And now each of these curves is a path to reduce emissions to 0 and do that in such a way that the temperature does not go above, the delta T does not go above 2 degrees centigrade. And the parameter that determines the separate curves is the starting point. When do we start, okay? If we started back here, you can see 2 things. One, to start off with, there was less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so we didn't have to work as hard to get it out. And secondly, the slope of the curve, in other words, the rate at which we have to make the changeover from fossil fuels and the like to 0 emission sources is much more gradual. Here we are right here in 2020. If we start now, okay, we can follow, roughly speaking. The climate scientists, by the way, seem to love to do a zillion scenarios and put them on the same chart so that they blend into one solid color. But we can almost follow that. Look at that. From 2020, whoops, sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you with this one. From 2020, you know, we're halfway there by 2040. So in 20 years, this particular scenario says we start in 2020, ramp down by a factor of 2, and then we run this out so that we reach 0 emissions somewhere out here in the late part of this century, okay? And you see that the obvious thing is the earlier you start, the more time you have to do it and the less extreme the job is. And if we wait, for example, till 2035, okay, then we see that we have to, sorry. If we wait till 2035, roughly, then we see that we have to ramp down much faster, okay? And that we have about 10 years to get to half the emissions, and we end up at 0 somewhere in the 2080 timeframe, something like that. This is for 2 degrees. This is the easy one, okay? If we want to stick with the plan of limiting emissions limiting the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, this is the set of curves we have to look at, and it's a lot more extreme. The amount of carbon dioxide that we have left that we can put into the atmosphere for a 2-degree rise in temperature is estimated to be about 600 to 800 billion tons of carbon dioxide. To limit it to 1.5 degrees, it's more like 100 to 200. And you see, right now we're doing 40 billion tons a year. So that makes things a lot tighter. Again, earlier, if we'd started back in 2010, okay, it would have been duck soup. We would have had all the way out until 2070, roughly, to reach zero carbon emissions, and we could have satisfied 1.5 degrees. We didn't. It's 2020. In 2020, it looks like we have to get down to zero over here around 2050, and these are the calculations on their basis for the the goal of zero emissions by 2050 in the Biden and House plans. Notice that if we diddle around for 10 years, we don't have any time to get to zero emissions. That's all this is saying, is that 1.5 degrees is an extremely difficult target to make. Okay. So, excuse me a second while I remember what I was going to say. Okay, so in order to get these goals, follow these rather ambitious plans, the world has to start now and get very serious about reducing carbon dioxide. And if we follow these plans to the letter, okay, if we actually do this, okay, just by reducing carbon dioxide emissions, okay, changing over to non-polluting methods of generating power, for example, and so on and so forth. If we actually do this, okay, there's no need for any of the technologies that would actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, okay? On the other hand, and to quote Nellie Forbush, who you may remember was the nurse in South Pacific, you'd have to be a cockeyed optimist to believe that this is actually going to happen. To believe that we were going to start soon and with all guns blazing and take this path seems to me to require that you spoke something strong. Even with a Democratic sweep in November, okay, it's going to be some time before plans can be put in place and before the certain rearguard action of the fossil fuel and other industries and whoever else has a vested interest in this, are subdued, okay, before we can actually really start. We also have to find the resources, and so does the rest of the world, to do this. And there's a huge difference between postulating to being sitting in your office on your computer and saying, what if we ramp down emissions like this? Where does that get us? What if we do this? Where does that? There's a big difference between doing that and actually implementing it. So it seems to me inevitable that there'll be an overshoot. That is to say that when, for example, if 1.5 degrees is our goal, when 2050 comes, we'll be somewhere up here, still emitting a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, not having gotten ourselves down to where we need to be to keep the temperature rise down there. Okay, it seems inevitable. And because the natural processes that remove carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, but let's mostly focus on carbon dioxide, the natural processes that take it out are very slow. Whoops, there we are. So hundreds to thousands of years, we can't depend on those to ride in and remove the carbon dioxide that we weren't able to get out of the atmosphere. So it's necessary for humans to deliberately take action that are required to actually take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And what we would need to do that are called negative emission technologies. And that's talked about in the IPCC. It's mentioned in both of these plans. And one of the dangers is depending on it to pull our bacon out of the fire. It is not a silver bullet that's going to let the world off the hook. And so far as I can tell, there's no way that even if we're quite successful at developing these negative emission technologies, that they will be powerful enough to they'll be powerful enough to eliminate the need to do away with carbon dioxide, to mitigate that, eliminate the need to follow these curves, okay? I've just said we probably aren't going to be able to follow these curves, but we're still going to have to try darn hard to do it and make the tough choices that require us to do that. NETs, negative emission technologies, are not going to come riding in on a white horse and save us, okay? Having said that, however, we've just said it's a very, very difficult problem in general to do this, and we're going to need all the help we can get. We're going to have to employ all the tools we can add to our arsenal to do that. So we need to research, we need to develop, we need to test, we need to study, we need to do whatever we can to develop technologies that will actually take carbon out of the atmosphere. So let's see, the next slide. This is the next slide, right? No, that's not the next slide. How do I do that? There are general categories. These are general categories of net emission technologies. And I've taken this slide and some other stuff from a report from the European Academies of Scientific Advice Council. There are sort of two general categories. Actually, most of these fall into the first, and this one falls into the second category. The amount of carbon dioxide in the air, like even at 400 parts per million, is tiny. That's 0.04%, okay? 4 molecules out of every 10,000 are carbon dioxide. So that's a very different problem than carbon capture and sequestration at point sources. And by point sources, we mean smokestacks, where the stuff is concentrated at 20 or 25% of the molecules are carbon dioxide, okay? So those are two different sets of problems. Even though this CCS will be important in two of the major postulated technologies up here. So what are these things? Afforestation, reforestation, plant a lot of trees. The trees take up carbon dioxide. They sequester the carbon dioxide until they die and decay, or they're harvested, or there's a fire or something like that. But if you plant the right trees, that can last a long time and take up a lot of carbon. There are issues with all of these things, by the way. The major issue with all of these things is scale, and scale has some sub-issues like environmental effects that were unanticipated by going to the scale that you need to do to take a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Land management means changing or evolving our agricultural practices, okay, to increase the amount of carbon that is fixed in the soil. Most soils lost about 50% of the carbon it came with, okay, originally had, and that can be put back by various methods, and various methods of changing how I don't do it, but how farmers practice agriculture. And of course, you know what they're going to run into here. They're going to run into agribusiness, which wants to do industrialized agriculture, crop planting, and so on and so forth, and monocrops. And that is in conflict with this goal. But if we can do this, this can be effective at taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil. And both of these are, of course, well-developed technologies. Bioenergy production with carbon capture and storage means grow plants to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, then burn those plants, burn that biomatter in power plants to generate electricity. So thus replacing or changing the nature of our fossil fuel power plants right now. This was the most relied on by the IPCC. Oh, you burn it, and of course, then you need a well-developed technology for carbon capture and sequestration. Sequestration means taking the carbon dioxide and doing something with it so it doesn't come back into the atmosphere. Burying it deep under the ground, somehow getting it to be taken up by rocks. Maybe there even talk of using it in products. I don't quite understand that one, but there we are, unless it stays there, okay. This has been demonstrated at a very low scale. Scaling this up would have some substantial issues. Enhanced weathering is an interesting one. I told you that the weathering process is the process by which natural things take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is very slow, okay? And the process is where carbon dioxide in the atmosphere dissolves in rainwater, reacts with silicate rocks like basalt and so on, and forms sedimentary rocks which store the carbon away for a long time. That's a very slow process. How do you enhance it? Well, the idea is to grind up the silicate rocks, the basalt, for example, to very, very fine dust and spread it out over fields. Can even be a kind of fertilizer. And therefore, by grinding it up, you've increased the surface area by an enormous amount, and therefore the rate at which carbon dioxide is stored. Direct air capture. Now, this is one that I think a lot of people have seen pictures of and stuff like that. Giant things sucking air in and getting rid of the carbon dioxide, okay? This does not involve growing anything. This involves blowing large amounts of atmospheric air, okay, over some kind of sorbent that either adsorbs or adsorbs. It has some affinity for carbon dioxide, and it either adsorbs it or absorbs it or adsorbs it, okay? Then heating it, and again, using CCS, carbon capture, to remove the carbon dioxide from that process and hide it someplace, put it someplace, okay? I'm not gonna talk about this, that's too much like, I think that's too much like geoengineering. So finally we come to this, carbon capture and sequestration at point sources. This is a fairly, at least, there's a lot of work to do in research that could improve the efficiency and so on and the cost points of this technology. But it's relatively mature. And I think, in fact, it's in operation at 2 plants in somewhere, one in Canada and 2 big power plants, one in the US, I forget where they are. Okay, and I think it's an opportunity that we've missed. If we'd actually gone into this heavily, and that would take some kind of government encouragement, investment and regulation and legislation and so on. But had we done that, we might have bought ourselves an extra 10 or 20 years, because we could put this on smokestacks, and that's where, as Pat showed you for electric generation, about 20, maybe a little less than 25% of the carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere comes from right now. And we could have captured, suppose we captured half of it, okay? We developed this and captured half, we would have been quite a bit ahead now. And so I think that was an opportunity to last, but maybe we can get it back. Okay, I was gonna show you a slide. Okay, not too bad. Next slide. I lifted this from that same report, and this, I don't want to go over this, but it just shows you, it helps to show what kind of the status is of this now. These 2 are existing technologies. These are ones that have to be developed. These have been demonstrated, but they need to be developed further. And there's a lot of research that could go in to make all of these processes more efficient and effective. This is what the cost. They can be very costly. This is $150 per ton. So if we're talking about a gigaton, we're talking about 150 billion. And if you want to do 10 gigatons, that's a number we don't want to talk about. Okay, so we got to get the cost down as well. Some of these processes are vulnerable to changes, like climate change can affect how the forests grow and so on. They can have an effect on the climate, okay? A large amount of reforestation or afforestation, and it would take a large amount, okay, means you might change significantly the reflectivity of the Earth's surface. Trees are dark, sand is light, it reflects the sun, trees absorb the sun, so it may change that. Also, trees transpire a lot of moisture in the air, can actually affect the climate. And there are things like that you have to worry about in all of these technologies. The biggest thing in all of this is scale. None of this stuff has been demonstrated on anything like a planetary scale, even a statewide scale, okay? Let's see, I can't see, and there's some very, very rough theoretical calculations in the literature of what you might expect if everything worked out perfectly well, okay, what you might expect in terms of gigatons of carbon dioxide removed per year. And I think over here it says something like 50 to 60. Don't believe those numbers. Those are wildly, wildly optimistic, okay? So what I would would close with so remember that 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide go into the atmosphere every year, okay? Let me go back up here. Okay, so 40 gigatons right now are going into the atmosphere every year. If we delay 5 years before doing anything, that's 200 gigatons of carbon dioxide. That's the entire margin we have for reaching the 1.5 degree thing. And it's a good fraction of the margin we have for reaching 2 degrees centigrade, okay? So I think we've definitely lost the opportunity to get to 1.5 degrees without a significant overshoot. But the idea of the net emission is that even if we do get an overshoot, we can pull that back, okay? And if we could get from these technologies, from a range of these technologies, if we could get 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide taken out of the atmosphere per year, say starting in 2050, that'd be 500 gigatons. That'd get us back to where we want to be, okay? Now, a lot of damage can be done while we wait for these technologies to be developed and to bring the carbon down. So the sooner we get into research, the sooner we get into development, enabling legislation in particular, and that's included in both plans, by the way, the better.
We got an election coming up. I think it's pretty clear that if the Democrats don't take both houses of Congress and the executive branch, none of this is really going to happen. That's my view of things. The good thing about these plans is that they recognize the magnitude of the problem, and they don't nibble around the edges or anything. They attack it full force. So hopefully we will have a good outcome for the election. I have a slide for the Republican plan, such as it is, but I won't show it. I think what's going to happen, my opinion is, we're going to have to wait and see how bad things get before the American public is really ready to invest in what we have to do. All of these plans are top-down government plans. A lot of people don't like big government. It'll be resisted by certain branches of conservative political persuasion. And what the action that occurs will be dependent on how we see coming out of things like the pandemic, which has made us all realize how vulnerable we are and how much government action really makes a difference. So I'll just leave it at that, and we can maybe take some questions.
Well, there's a question, this is probably for Pat, asking who is developing the modular reactors?
Maybe Dave can answer that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Question, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, now I got you. Yeah.
Okay. The question was, who is developing the modular reactors?
Okay, there are private companies doing it. There's a company called NuScale, NuScale, and they were the ones who had them furthest developed. Bill Gates has a company, I don't know what the name of it, they're doing it, but mostly it's private investment, and that's part of the problem. They've got to raise money to do this, and it's taking a chance because nobody knows which ones are going to pan out. So does that answer your question?
Well, I wasn't the one that asked it. Tim, does that answer your question? Yes, affirmative, positive.
Yeah, there's more than one company working on it.
Yeah, and I would say that there's kind of a false distinction between the small modulars and the Generation 4, because several of the Generation 4 are small modular reactors. They're just a little further down in the future than the NuScale small modular.
Right. I sort of made an arbitrary division there to talk about them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the nuclear people understand that, first of all, the public hates nuclear, so it's a real political hurdle because they're afraid. And there's been such incredible cost overruns and time overruns on building these things, besides the safety issues, that there's a pretty much the negative feeling about them. And, but so the Generation 4, they look to try to get safety better. They tried to get safety, meaning like meltdowns. They tried to get waste better, and then they tried to get the cost down. And one of the ways is by having these small modulars where they can kind of, they even talk about prefab, making them in factories and then bringing them out almost like modular homes, you know. And they tend to be on the order of 100 megawatts as opposed to the gigawatt or several gigawatt designs of the conventional nucleus.
So we have another question along those lines. What is the cost factor on the development these smaller, hopefully safety reactors is?
I suspect that nobody really knows what the answer is until they really have a demonstration model. I mean, it's going to take one of the things that have hurt nuclear all along is that it's been undercut by natural gas and other energy sources. It's expensive to develop, and it's expensive to license, and you know, going through all the safety procedures and so forth. So I can't answer the question about what the cost of these eventually will be compared to other sources. If that was the question, I don't really know.
There is the estimates on some of these were $300 million for a 100 megawatt station, but that's once they get them in kind of mass production. But that's a goal, as Pat says. I mean, you know, there's been so many overruns in the nuclear business that who knows if that's a real number.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. Another question is, I would like to know the Republican plan to lower CO2 emissions. And I guess the assumption is there is one.
Let me see if I can pull that up. Okay. Here's the Republican plan.
There you go. Looks about right. Okay.
Yeah, as you know, they have no platform this year, so
Right.
4 years to even look see if there's anything.
So we have a comment and a question. Our local refuse company, EDCO, is moving towards collecting household organic waste, converting it to biofuel to power their EDCO vehicles. Is there any way we can increase the scale of this idea to divert organic waste in our landfills on a larger scale?
That's an interesting question. I don't, yeah, go ahead. What? I say it's an interesting question. I don't have the technical background to answer it in any great detail, but I mean, organic matter will, organic matter it's organic because it's trapped carbon, or it's made out of carbon, okay? And it can be used in a converted power plant. You just need a lot of it. I mean, for example, this bioenergy carbon capture technique, the estimate is that for it to say generate 20% of the world's power requirements that way, 1/5 of the world's power requirements, would take about 5% of the world's land. Okay, now that's going to run up against, crops for food and various other things, wildlife refuges and so on. So it's a big issue. I think if we wanted to do some fraction of that, it wouldn't have that scaling problem. But I don't see why it would be different from burning grass or lumber chips or anything like that.
So
Well,
it
it's a
sounds
bit
like
different,
what you're
Larry.
saying. Go ahead.
It's a bit different. I mean, the interesting thing about that question is that, as you know, the three of us are from NASA, and we're basically astronomers. It's our background. There was an astronomer at UC Berkeley named Frank Hsu, who very much pushed the idea of, on a mass scale, converting organic waste basically back into coal. And the idea was that he could build these, and he actually had a design, and there were people working on that, particularly in the government of Taiwan. But the idea was you take the organic waste and you put it in this place that has no air, and you heat it up to, I forget, like 500 degrees or 400 degrees, and it basically turns back into charcoal and coal. And that will not decay in any period of time. Organic waste, the problem is that it actually decays and puts the carbon dioxide and methane and stuff back into the atmosphere, although it takes a little bit of time, but on a short time scale relatively. If you put it into coal, it can stay for millions of years, sequestered as carbon. And so, and even if you burned that coal, it was called carbon neutral, because it would have, if you hadn't, if you hadn't burned it and just left it as organic waste, it was going to turn into carbon dioxide and methane anyway. So that was, there was an idea.
There's a difference because you've got the bio waste, okay? You burn it in a power plant, okay? You capture the carbon dioxide and sequester it. So you've done away with the carbon dioxide, and it's been taken out of the atmosphere by the growing plants. In addition, you have replaced a fossil fuel plant with a bioenergy fuel plant. So it's got that extra. One of the things about the biochar process is they talked about using that to fertilize soil, and that is one way of sequestering the carbon.
But it sounds like you wouldn't be able to, getting back to the original question of local vehicles using it, that if I'm understanding you right, that is something that could be done on that small scale. But as far as scaling it up to make an appreciable difference, that would be the problem with organic waste.
Yeah, I think you're right there. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's generated all over the place at point sources, basically. So it's distributed. Whereas presumably a power plant would be next to the fields that were growing the stuff that it burned. So, yeah.
But in the Hsu plan, the idea was, it's almost like, we have recycling plants in every community and so forth. The idea was, I mean, these plants, to convert it to charcoal, only cost like $1 million. I mean, we're not talking $300 million or billions of dollars. And so the idea would be that every community would have it, and then all the organic waste would go to that and be turned into charcoal, basically. And so, I mean, but it would be a very distributed form of trying to lower the carbon imprint.
Okay, so another question we have is based around the use of hydrogen or liquid hydrogen. Is that factor into this in any way?
Yeah, matter of fact, hydrogen is mentioned in both plans. And I think one of the basic ideas of using hydrogen is it is a way of converting electricity into a combustible. For instance, a lot of industry needs very high temperature, has very high temperature operations like steel making or something like that. It's not always easy to get that just by running electric currents, although there are electric ways of making steel. But if you effectively turn electricity into a burnable fuel, that is, you make hydrogen by breaking down water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then you burn the hydrogen, which burns very clean. You just turn it back into water again. So hydrogen is like a transition medium for turning electricity into heat. The problem with hydrogen is that it's very hard to handle. It leaks almost everything. It's very difficult. Nevertheless, there are large-scale projects now that are looking very seriously at using hydrogen as a fuel, that is hydrogen made from renewable energy, renewable electricity, and then burning it someplace, and it would burn clean. I think that's one of the aspects of hydrogen that might answer the question.
Okay, well, that's really good. Well, it looks like we've kind of run over our time a little bit. Maybe you could offer up any last suggestions on what can be done personally for everybody individually in our daily lives, besides putting all Democrats in.
Well, that was my answer.
Yeah, vote is the big thing.
Yeah, I guess it really does. That's the common denominator to the whole thing, because I guess unless, as you kind of said before, unless we do that, a lot of this is moot.
Yeah, and it is really, it takes us as a society and as a world collective action to deal with this. I think that's the main point. And the way we do collective actions, usually, if it's not through our church or the Fallbrook, climate action team, it's through government. And there's where the big issue is going to come down to, whether we're able to do it or not. That is my view.
Okay.
Well, I mean, you guys are learning a lot and you're passionate about this. You can educate your legislatures. California is pretty blue, as we know, but yeah.
Not this corner.
No, is that right? Well, then good. You can educate those legislatures. They pay attention to letters. They pay attention to visits. You know that, yeah.
Well, that's why we exist. The purpose of the Fallbrook Climate Action Team is to influence local people on what a climate action plan should be.
Great.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for asking us to give this talk.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
A lot for you
Bravo.
for getting involved in doing it. That's what I think.
Good job, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Okay.
Okay. That'll be it.
Terry, are you there?
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.